It's important to understand something about Titus Salt before you look at all the buildings in Saltaire. Titus Salt was born in 1803 and died in 1876. He moved to Bradford with his family in 1820 when he was about 16 or 17 years of age. Bradford had become a magnet for people seeking work or business opportunities. From 1800 to 1850, it experienced an 8-fold population increase as a result of the rapid industrialization of the processes required to convert raw wool into finished cloth. Titus's father established himself as a wool merchant and became active in politics and public life. The Salts were liberal in politics and Congregationalist in religion. After a few years working in Bradford mills and learning the trade, Titus partnered with his father and they were to add spinning to their business. In 1829, Titus married the daughter of a wealthy farmer from the Grimsby area. They were to have 11 children, 2 of whom died in infancy, and 1 daughter who died aged 19 years. By the 1830s, Bradford had become a foul and overcrowded place. There was abject poverty, lawlessness, and high levels of untreated industrial waste and foul air. In 1835, Titus set up his own business. He had begun to experiment in secret with alpaca wool from Peru. He found how to use alpaca alongside cotton to produce durable, light, lustrous cloth at a reasonable cost. This would make his fortune. His business in Bradford greatly expanded, as did his involvement in political and public life. In 1848, he became Bradford's mayor, and he was already renowned for the philanthropy which continued throughout his life. About 10 years after he'd been mayor, he was Bradford's MP. Though his business was doing very well, it was spread across many mills and warehouses, and by mid-century, every textile process had been mechanized. A factory that incorporated every one of these innovations was possible, but it would be immense, and consequently would not be in the crowded city of Bradford. A rural location also allowed the possibility of getting away from the dreadful conditions in the city, and as Titus himself said, of providing work for my 5 sons. That rural location was to become Saltaire, and around 150 years after the mill was opened, Saltaire was to become a World Heritage Site, a place recognised as having global importance. Well, this is Salts Mill, the famous Salts Mill. It's colossal, isn't it? It's big today by any standards, even today. And we're talking about 170 years since this was built. At the time, it was probably the biggest factory in the world. And that's not a boast. I think it's almost certainly the case. It holds the biggest room in the world at that time, the size of 6.5 football pitches. And in its basement, there's a reservoir with a capacity of 2.25 million litres of water. It was designed to take raw materials in at one end and to churn out cloth at the other end. That was possible at this point in 1852, 1853 when it was being built, because all of the processes had been mechanised. And one of the things that allowed them to do was to make cloth in huge quantities. Each day they could produce 18 miles or 27 kilometres of cloth. People say that Titus Salt built this. That's not true in my view. He never dug a hole or laid a brick, but his was the vision, and he did finance it, whilst at least 700 people working for about 13 companies did the building. So we're now at the dining hall, although as you probably see in the picture, it's called the mill building these days, but it was the dining hall for Salt's Mill. And a contract for this works canteen was issued in 1854, at a time when there was a place to work, i.e. the mill, but at the same time there was nowhere for anybody to live because none of the houses had been built. So it was quite appropriate to build the dining hall at this point where people could come and have their lunch. Unfortunately, though it was designed as a canteen, it was not used as one for many years, but it was used as a school, as a Sunday school, and as a meeting room. It has a secret tunnel entrance, and now it has 2 floors, but it was built with only one. The conversion took place more than 40 years later, and one of the sad facts about that is that when they were installing the floor in the building, it collapsed, killing one of the workmen. So here we are at the first shops and houses that were built in Saltaire. The mill was already built, so we're talking about 1854, 1855, when these shops on my left were built and when this block of houses to my right were built. It took about 20 years for all of Saltaire's houses to be built. Long time, but then there were 850 houses, which is pretty big. It's a decent sized village or a small town that's been built. Several of the corner shops in the body of the village are now houses. Many of the larger houses in Saltaire, because there were a variety of houses, some small, some large, but many of the larger houses were described as overlookers' houses. But in fact, they weren't just reserved for people who were foremen and senior managers. In fact, if you could afford the rent, you could live in the large house. And many people were able to do this because they had large families with many people many of the family actually working in the mill. The houses had running water and gas, and each had its own outside toilet. Now, that's not too big a deal to us, but in Victorian times, that was really splendid. Not only that, the houses benefited from a proper drainage system. The stuff that people wanted to throw away, the water from washing up, even the poo and the wee, I'm afraid, used to go down the middle of streets, but not in Saltaire. So here we are, we're at Saltaire Congregational Church. It's now called the United Reformed Church. And it was opened in 1859, and it's surely the most beautiful building in Saltaire. No wonder it's Grade 1 listed, the most prestigious accolade any building can get in Britain. It's on a par with Hampton Court Palace and Salisbury Cathedral. And it's lovely outside and in, though it's quite difficult to find it open. It's no surprise that the finest and most central of the churches in Saltaire, there are 2 of them, but the finest and most central is the Congregational Church, because Salt was a very active Congregationalist. And a small extension was added a couple of years after the opening. What happened was that they built a mausoleum for the Salts family, and we'll see that in a second on the film. The church cost £16,000 to build. Around a dozen years ago, a significant amount of lottery money was put up to pay for a major renovation. And one of the things that they did was to replace the spire at the top, and the spire cost £16,000. So one of the most interesting things about the church is where it's positioned. It's positioned right opposite the front entrance of Salt's Mill. So on the one hand you've got Jesus and Salt's religion, and on the other hand you've got Salt, the capitalist, the man who's making a lot of money. This is a new mill. She was built in 1868, and it sits between the canal, which is on my left, and the river, which is on the right. The river has a weir. The weir was built in 1635, not by Titus Salt, of course. It was built in 1635 to take water into this mill, the mill that was here. The mill that was here was called Dixon Mill, and the water came from the top of the weir underneath, turning a water wheel. Of course, that's some time ago. Dixon Mill was then grinding corn. The new mill, this one, was constructed to house machinery for spinning yarn. And presumably that was because they built this because Salt's mill wasn't big enough, which is a bit of a surprise given how enormous it actually is. So this is 1868 when new mill was built, and its principal feature is this wonderful tall and ornate chimney. And this chimney was modelled on the bell tower of the biggest church in Venice, believe it or not. The bell tower of Santa Maria Gloriosa dei Frari. So this is a little bit of Italy in Saltaire. Now, another thing which is really interesting about this mill, as I told you, it was a spinning mill, but in fact it's had many uses over the years, and one of the most interesting ones came at the end of the Second World War. At the end of the Second World War, there were many people in continental Europe who were displaced, who were homeless, who were not in their home country even. At the same time, Britain was trying to recover from the war, but the lack of labour was a big problem for the government at the time. And so the government went out into Europe and recruited all people who were displaced. And of course, there was a good benefit for them because they had a home and a job and what have you when they came over here. So in the late 1940s, Salt's Mill was welcoming women to work in New Mill and in the main mill too. And what they had to do, because they didn't have enough space for these people, didn't have houses for these people, they transformed this mill, one floor of this mill, into a hostel for women mainly from Italy and from Poland. The infirmary and dispensary with 6 beds, alongside 43 houses for the elderly, were completed in 1868. Initially built to treat injuries sustained in the mill, with minor conditions treated in the mill's own facility, it was sufficiently well equipped to perform operations. But the demand for medical services grew, and the hospital would soon be providing treatment for the local community. The hospital was extended twice, first by absorbing 4 of the almshouses, and secondly by the addition of a 3rd story in 1909. The almshouse's tenants lived rent-free and received a weekly pension, and in his will, Salt left £30,000, the annual income from which was to be used for the benefit of the sick and aged poor of Saltaire and the neighbourhood. In Saltaire, the monogram TS can be often seen. Salt's wife's monogram, CS, Caroline Salt, can only be seen in one place, and that's on the almshouses. The hospital was still going strong in 1947 when the NHS was formed, and it went on to provide health services until 1979. But the hospital is now apartments. Okay, so these are the schools that were built in 1868. The 1844 Factory Act required children between the ages of 8 and 13 to be employed for no longer than 6.5 hours a day and to receive 2 hours of education daily. These schools in Saltaire could accommodate 750 pupils, and their facilities were advanced. They had central heating, gas lighting and playgrounds. But two Education Acts, one in 1870 and the other in 1880, committed the country to universal school provision and to compulsory school attendance for all 5 to 10-year-olds. Consequently, the Saltaire schools capacity was soon insufficient. Space had to be made available, and it was made available in the Saltaire Club and Institute, which is opposite these schools and is now called Victoria Hall. But even that wasn't enough, and within a decade a new school in Albert Road was built for children aged 3 to 10 years, and that school still exists, along with, of course, the two schools here. Just a final point, there are two schools here, but surprisingly in one building, but there's an entrance on one side and an entrance on the other for boys and girls. Opposite the schools is the Club and Institute. You probably won't recognise that name because it's now called just Victoria Hall. It was opened in 1870 and 1871, which is about 2 to 3 years after the schools opposite. And it was unusual. Many mechanics institutes had been created across Britain in the previous 50 years, providing education for adult working people. But Saltaire's Institute also offered leisure activities. Titus Salt Jr., who was the youngest son of Titus Salt, announced his family's intentions in this way. He said it was to provide a social club and an educational institute to supply the advantages of a public house without its evils. The facilities included a reading room, library, laboratory, chess and draughts rooms, smoking room, billiard room, bagatelle room, a lecture hall seating 800 people, classrooms, a gymnasium and a rifle drill room. Quite something, but of course this magnificent building needed filling. Together with the new schools, the Institute formed an impressive open quadrangle. It was a deliberate design feature. At the four corners of the landscape gardens fronting the buildings are sculptures of lions by Thomas Milnes. They carry the names War, Peace, Vigilance and Determination. Opened in 1871, this park, which is called Roberts Park now, but was called Saltaire Park originally. This small but perfect in every detail park is the most notable of the public spaces in Saltaire. Salt had already established his commitment to public parks whilst he was in Bradford. And of course he was mayor of Bradford, as I told you earlier. As a private citizen, he actually was very supportive of building public parks in Bradford, particularly Peel Park. It wasn't just a matter of supporting them, he actually was putting money in so that the land that became Peel Park would be bought. Saltaire Park was integral to the thinking behind the Club and Institute, which we've talked about earlier, because what the Salt family believed was that working people require wholesome activities, which meant not going down to the pub, basically. So for many years, the river itself was a key part of the activities in Saltaire Park. And it was widened for fishing, swimming, rowing, and actually going on a pleasure boat as well. Now the name changed from Saltaire Park to Roberts Park in 1920, and the reason it became known as Roberts Park was because the land was given to the people of Bradford by Sir James Roberts. Sir James Roberts was the guy who owned Salt's Mill and the village between about 1893 and 1918. And when he walked away from it, when he sold it on, he took this land with him. And in 1920 he gave it back. And at that point it became Roberts Park in memory of his son Bertram, who had died very early. It might be worth saying another thing about James Roberts, because James Roberts was a great philanthropist too, like Titus Salt. And his most famous gift to Britain, really, was the fact that he bought the parsonage in Haworth. The parsonage in Haworth, where Charlotte Brontë and her sisters wrote their famous novels. He actually bought that parsonage and gave it to the trustees who own it today and make it open to the public.